Well, friends, it's good to be here as part of this conversation. I, too, am a fan of First Things, a regular reader, and got to know Father Newhouse when I was a graduate student. And in fact, coming here reminds me of a time he spoke at Yale, and I gave him a ride back, and we had a long conversation about Augustine and American democracy. And I remember as we were arriving across whatever bridge we came across, he said, the New Jerusalem, New York City. He also ended one of in his book, American Babylon, he talked about when he died and meets God, he will meet him as an American. Which I thought as a provocation for, I thought he was Canadian, but I guess he was American by citizenship. But we may get into questions about how to bring this 5th century North African bishop into dialogue with our moment. And I think what Father Newhouse was trying to also do was weave the story of creation, fall, and redemption into our lives and the identities we have in embodied relationships. I don't think he would be a fan of certain moves in Christian nationalism and integralism today, but that it's an interesting moment. But we're here to talk about something else, and I think it's especially important. Chris's award-winning book was just named Book of the Year by Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine. Is that a heresy thing to mention? Christianity Today?
That's your warning.
No.
Biblical critical theory. How the Bible's unfolding story makes sense of modern life and culture. And I think especially theology is a relatively marginalized discipline in the academy, although there has been a renaissance of interest in theology in certain quarters, I think primarily as intellectual history and also attention to political theology. But obviously there's public energy around the topic of critical theory and how, if at all, the concerns of critical theory can be addressed by the church. And I think that's what this book sets out to do. So thanks for the gift of this book. It recalls, some of you may come from this background as well, my formation among what has been called the young, restless, and reformed, people very interested in worldview apologetics and trying to bring together the Bible, doctrine, and cultural analysis. And I appreciate the way this book promises to do that in a, how shall I put it, positive way of encouragement in our polarized age. There's a line on page 161 where he says he's neither a pessimistic Eeyore nor a utopian Tigger. And what the book tries to do, I think, is woo us with Augustine's vision of a different city, wandering among the ungodly, as Augustine puts it in the preface, but in a way that has a kind of magnetism of wisdom about the good, the true, and the beautiful, to speak in old-fashioned ways. There's a lot of critical analysis in the book. It's demythologizing and unmasking, so to speak. Sometimes Augustine is seen as the original critical theorist. He's the critic of the Roman Empire. Sometimes scholarship makes Augustine look a bit too much like an early version of the 1619 Project, that his takedown of Roman imperialism is all critique. Whereas I think what Chris does is use critique, but in the service of the gospel. So it's not a relentless critique. A common danger in academic work, we're trained as academics to do critique. It's like a hypercritical style that spreads like kudzu, and we have no other forms of intellectual life. I think Carl Trueman had a nice line in the First Things essay he wrote. What was it called? Biblical
Grace theory.
Biblical grace theory. Yeah. That we should avoid a critical theory that is all law and no gospel. And I think Chris also has some lines in the book about ways in which critical theory has been used to kind of hyper-spiritualize the quest for social justice that's detached from or perverted from a kind of biblical view. And I take the primary goal of this book, for those of you I know, perhaps not all of you have read all 670 pages. Not so much to explain the Bible to our culture, though if you have or are a secular reader, you'll learn a lot about Christian faith, but really to explain our culture through the Bible. That is how a Barthian might say it. There's not much Karl Barth in the book. There's a lot of Bavinck. One reviewer described it as neo-Calvinism meets radical orthodoxy. But if we need a label, I think one that I am sympathetic with is it's a kind of Christian humanism that we desperately need, I think. And I suspect many readers of First Things might appreciate. Though I will note that when I use that term Christian humanism, even some of my university colleagues get nervous. Maybe for some of the reasons we'll get into, that it's a code word for traditionalism. It's complicit with domination. It's complicit with a certain understanding of the human that was built by the Western Eurocentric mind of Christian theology. I have three areas I'd like to talk about, but before doing that, I just wanted to give you a chance maybe to begin with some definitions and some motivations. So, biblical critical theory. What do you mean by critical theory? Right? Because lots of folks are talking about critical theory these days. Sometimes it's adjacent to critical race theory in particular, sometimes not. A hermeneutics of suspicion that's hostile to all forms of faith and authority. A rejection of the false promise of Enlightenment reason. Or sometimes a very particular notion. Critical theory is often in academia specifically about the Frankfurt school of Herkheimer and Adorno that coined this term. It's more Kant than Nietzsche and Derrida. But you kind of have a lot of going on there, including urgent political issues related to critical theory. So critical theory is thinking that is attentive to social, economic, political context. It's problematizing things. But what do you think critical theory is, and why do you frame the book that way? In the foreword, Tim Keller says critical theory is just getting beneath the surface of things, which is a pretty broad definition, and certainly has an Augustinian ring to it, because that's what Augustine was trying to do in the City of God, is kind of get beneath the surface stories that were being told to expose them, right? But you talk about feminism, post-colonial theory, psychoanalysis, Marx, Foucault, Kristeva. There's a risk that there's like maybe a little too much jargon for my down-home American pragmatist sensibilities, but why critical theory and what is critical theory?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And just before I answer that, huge thanks to echo Jay's thanks. You're so generous in hosting us. Thank you, Rusty. Thank you, everyone who works here. It's a real honour for you guys to host us, and we're really grateful. Thank you. Critical theory means all things to all people. That's the problem with it. It's one of these sort of umbrella terms. I first came across it when I was an undergrad. We did a unit called Modern Critical Theory. It didn't have any Frankfurt School in it at all. It was mainly Derrida, Foucault, Kristeva, those sort of people. And I guess that to cut what could be a very boringly long story short, there are two senses. There's a broad sense and a narrow sense. The broad sense is philosophy in the wake of the Kantian critical term, where we start questioning the limits of knowledge rather than sort of assuming that we can know everything and just going out there and doing it, and being reflexive about the limits of our knowledge. But as you're rightly saying, there's also a political sense of critical theory, which is we're critiquing the status quo. We're finding a place to stand. And that is really problematic. We might want to come back to that idea. Where do you stand to do this? But finding a place to stand from which we can say, this part of society or this institution or this thing that we do is unjust and needs to be reformed. And either implicitly or explicitly, this is what a proper functioning society looks like. And there's the Marxist version of that with the Frankfurt School. And there's also another strand, I think, that's really important to have on our radar, which is like a Nietzschean critical theory, which is not sort of stridently political, but is more seeing power constructed. So truth is constructed, power is constructed, and the later Nietzsche with the will to power. The idea is that we construct the self and the reality that we want, and that's much more of. It tends not to be so overtly political. It tends to be what Foucault called the care of the self, like constructing one's own identity, almost as a placeholder for being able to be politically active. So there's this Nietzschean stream and there's this Marxist stream, and they cross over and they borrow from each other. But I think there are two distinct tendencies within it.
So this Kantian stream, Marxist stream, change.
Well, they're sort of both coming from Kant, but then the sort of the Marx goes one way and the Nietzsche goes
so
another.
Kant had a bit more hope for the possibilities of rationality than some of the latter-day critical theorists.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I found also just personally resonance with the story you also tell, kind of at the beginning of the book, that, as you mentioned, in university, you're taking these courses in critical theory, but as a Christian, you start to think, wow, Christianity also has something like a critical theory or resources for social criticism, at least. And I remember when I was an undergrad at a secular university, I was exposed to a lot of critical theory. And the options I was mainly given as a response was sort of Rawlsian liberalism or Straussian conservatism. And they battled for my soul, right? And they're partly because there was no courses. I mean, occasionally you might bump into Augustine in some English literature class where you read Confessions. Maybe if some Straussian is willing to hold their nose and teach Aquinas and Augustine or something like that as the road to some modern thinker. But there really isn't much attention to the resources within the Christian tradition, right? So let's talk maybe about that other word, biblical.
Yeah.
Right, so that also does a lot of work. I mean, I think we share a Reformed background, which is interested in the kind of vision of Scripture as a redemptive historical plot.
Yes.
Right, that has a unified story with multiple different chords, I guess. And you talk about obviously the grammar of the two cities from Augustine, the enchanted biblical world. Can you just say a little bit more about the commitment to the idea of the Bible as a unified narrative? And interestingly, I think even my current evangelicals, Princeton has a lot of evangelicals, might struggle more with the biblical part of your text than the critical theory part.
Yeah.
They're very smart and they've kind of been reared in critical theory, but their formation biblically, I've noticed a bit of a change. I grew up with Francis Schaeffer, James Sire, John Stott. Most of my evangelical students don't know who those people are. Right? I'm not even sure they read books like this, right? So there is a kind of interesting sociological question we can get into, but I'm more interested in maybe the theological. You spent a lot of time on Genesis, a lot of time on Exodus, a lot of time on the prophets, and then you bring in some specific, I think, terms from your French studies background. The meso-narrative, the transperspectival. So can you just say maybe a little bit about those terms, how they relate to how you conceive of biblical and biblical theology, where the story of the church doesn't just swallow the world, but it somehow is now put in both angular and also maybe complementary relation to critical theory.
Yeah. So the great model is Augustine for this, and what he does in the second half of the City of God, where as you will know better than I, he tells the biblical story as a way to, and this is John Milbank's turn, to out-narrate Rome. So Rome has this story it tells about itself, the eternal city, etc. And the way that Augustine tells the story of the Bible is to explain Rome to itself better than Rome understands itself. Like I can show you who you are more adequately and more richly than you understand yourselves. And he does that through telling this biblical story. And I think that the reason that it captured me, like this approach captured me so much, was that the idea that the if you like, the basic rhythm of the biblical story, very schematically put, creation, fall, redemption, consummation, it is an all-encompassing story of reality, and it gives you certain critical postures that are extremely hard to get without it. So just to take one example, the very fact that in the biblical narrative, creation is separate from the fall, is separate from the entry of sin into it, it's absolutely huge, critically speaking. Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, says that this is the most radical attempt to separate the origin of good from the origin of evil in almost any tradition. And therefore it gives the Christian coming to culture what we could call it like an asymmetrical view of good and evil. The fall is not a second symmetrical creation equal to the first, sort of some second ex nihilo world, but a twisting and deformation, and we can use lots of different metaphors to talk about it, of the creation. And therefore, sin never has the first word, and it's always derivative, parasitic, less than God's good creation. And that alone, if that were the only thing we took from the Bible story, that alone would give us an incredibly fruitful and productive and incisive basis upon which to talk about society. But we could go on that redemption, consummation. It's that all these different moves, these basic moves of the way the biblical story frames reality, giving you a purchase on it that is incredibly hard to get without a biblical frame. So I don't want to go on for too long, but say you don't have the difference between creation and fall. Say that the way things are, with gradual change over time, is basically the way they've always been. How do you critique the status quo? Where do you stand outside the status quo to be able to say, with an authority that is more than, I have good feelings about this, or I have bad feelings about this, that this thing is unjust? Because what there is what there is what there is. So it's just one bit of what there is critiquing another bit of what there is. And then the problem is, how do you justify choosing your bit of what there is to critique the other bit? Why choose this measure rather than that measure? Because they're all bootstrapping themselves. But the Christian isn't locked on the horns of that dilemma, because she can say, no, there is a vision outside the status quo of how things should be, from which, with humility and not as myself the source of all sort of wisdom and the idea of justice, I can say, this thing in society, and this is so precious for us today, isn't it? This thing in society is unjust. And if everybody in the world, including me, thought that it was just, it could still be unjust. It is possible for it still to be unjust. I just think there's a preciousness and a power about that, being able to say that. And being able to say that not on the basis of I know, I'm not where the book stops. So you keep your humility while doing it, And so we could go through the whole Bible, taking moments like this and just unpacking them critically. But just the difference between creation and fall is so incredibly productive, and so this will be my last sentence. Just sort of delicious in the way that it keeps you humble, but gives you a robust idea of injustice. So I can say this is wrong. But it's not. I'm not saying it on my authority. There's a healthiness about that.
So it's a kind of epistemic humility, but a kind of, you might, to use a fancy term, like a kind of ontological confidence that we are not making this all up. We are not the arbiters.
Yeah.
We are not the sources of ourselves or morality.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean I wonder if that maybe one of the first big areas maybe 3 big areas, 2 of them very small, okay, or short. So I want to also open things up for conversation. And this is kind of the first is maybe the genre and the spirit in which you write the book, and then I'm going to ask a question about the French material, which is your expertise, and then maybe we'll end with Augustine and contemporary politics. So one reviewer described your tone as winsome. That's some of you within evangelicalism know that's a source of some controversy in American evangelicalism these days. But I think that winsomeness is actually related to what you were just talking about in terms of the kind of strength of creation and a willingness to have a kind of epistemic humility, but a confidence in going out to the world. Those of us who come out of evangelical backgrounds, many of you may know, there often was an anti-intellectual component to that. But you narrate and out-narrate modernity, and this maybe betrays the influence of someone like John Milbank, as something like a Christian heresy.
Yes.
Or Chesterton, the world full of Christian ideas gone mad, or something like that. More than a kind of adversarial, hostile paganism, right? And the Spirit is kind of a generous orthodoxy that you say is meant to help us get out of our cultural impasse on both the left and the right. And so you introduce this term diagonalization, that you say is not a third wayism that's kind of toothless, but is a way to make progress with the help of the Bible, both on philosophical matters and maybe on political matters. And you present kind of the dangers of various temptations, both within Christian circles and critical theory circles, and suggest the Bible is more complex than these alternatives. And then you do present, at times, I felt like a third way, but it's a big book. There's lots of topics. It talks about economics. It talks about Brexit. It talks about all sorts of things. But could you just say a little bit about diagonalization? And also, I think it's related to the emphasis that I think has been a strong part of the Reformed tradition on worldviews. I have a kind of question about that, but maybe just start with diagonalization and why you think that is a helpful way to engage the reader interested in these questions.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we could start with the question: if creation and fall are separate, and the fall is a corruption and derivative, not a second pristine creation, what would we expect human culture to be like? And I think, to use the language that you just used, we would expect it to be some sort of heresy, that only God comes up with new truths. The devil twists and distorts and brings them out of proportion. And so I think we approach culture as Christians as in C.S. Lewis's words, a good thing spoiled. Things out of proportion, things sort of half-truths without the concomitant truth and things like that. And therefore it shouldn't surprise us if what we find is culture, and this is sort of a Chestertonian move as well, when it lets go of God, sort of catapulting itself to both extremes at once, or to a number of different extreme positions at once. It's when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they start believing in everything. So if you take an example like contemporary anthropology, so we've lost this image by and large, this idea of the image of God, and there's a beautiful harmony to the idea. Like, there are lots of theories of what precisely the image of God is, but I think on a basic level, whatever we think it is in the detail, it is both ennobling and humbling of human beings, because of everything in the whole creation, only everyone in this room, and everyone sleeping homeless on the streets of this city, and every human being is in the image of God. And that is an incredibly ennobling thing. Not a School of Wales, not a beautiful portrait, not the best symphony ever written. None of that is in the image of God. So there's a massive dignity. But of course, we are the image, not the God. Our being is contingent. To understand who we are, you've got to refer to one who is greater than us. And there's a humbling about that, being the image. And there's no sense in the image of God motif that these two things are struggling with each other, like we're half image and we're half God, and it's an uneasy marriage. There's a harmony there. So society lets go of that idea, and what happens to anthropology? Well, there's lots of different ways of parsing it out, but one way that you can think about the way that we as a society think about ourselves today is that there's one stream of thinking which essentially puts us in the position of God. So what does God do in the Bible? What is a Godish thing? It is to decide what is good and evil, and it is to be the one who says, I am who I am. I'm self-defining. I say who I am. I don't rely on anyone outside of me to tell me that. And those are precisely the traits that we see in a lot of society today. Nobody can tell me who I am. I am self-defining. I decide the meaning of my life for myself. That is mine alone to decide. I will decide what is good and evil. So that's one sort of stream of contemporary thinking about human beings. But there's also very uneasily, sitting alongside it, certainly in academic circles, a very big push to say that there is nothing exceptional about human beings. We may fancy that there's something, sort of that separates us from the rest of either the animal kingdom or just the rest of the material world. But, we need to have the courage to see that we are nothing more than complicated machines. We might be extremely complicated machines, but machines nonetheless. And so what you find is that, modern people are told, oh, you're a machine, you are only an animal like the others. And also, by the way, you're a god, a self-defining, sort of identifying God. Now, go and live in psychological peace with trying to conjure and you can see how that's incredibly psychologically burdensome for people. And so to diagonalize, to come back to your question, that dichotomy, how do you do that? Well, you don't say, well, let's meet in the middle then. Oh, perhaps we're half God and half machines. Let's try and keep everybody happy. It's not to do that. It's to say, the reason that you've got this dichotomy to begin with is you've forgotten the beautiful biblical harmony that sits behind it. So what we want to do is not, if you like, find a third way, start with your dichotomy and try and reconcile them, but go back to the first way. What you have ripped apart and dismembered to begin with, to end up with this sort of machine God. And so you diagonalize it by saying you don't need that dichotomy. It's both dangerous and unnecessary. You go back to the idea of the image of God, and you've got the humility that comes with saying we're machines. And a lot of the impetus for saying that academically is a good desire for a certain humility. We're not the rulers of the universe. We need to realise that. And so this idea of we're just one more animal is often impelled by this idea to give us a sober sort of humility. And I think what a lot of this self-defining, self-justifying is coming from is a sense that there is something dignified and special about us. But in that Chestertonian way, these things are all become monsters because they become detached from each other. And so that's how I explain diagonalizing.
And I think this is related to the genre question and why you wrote this sort of book and for whom, maybe. But I want to frame it in an Augustinian vein. There's some who, just to be very reductive, Augustine, his book, like yours, is a great museum of quotes, right? And you're just exposed to some of the great nuggets of Christian and secular thought. Much of what we know about a lot of ancient philosophy is because Augustine quoted them, right? Even though we have these lost texts, and he presents them in a certain way, and he does. He has a strong, how should we put it, like tournament of ideas. The Platonists are like almost close; they almost get it, but then their pride gets in the way, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's a similar spirit to your book. And as I said, in Reformed apologetics, I think there's been a strong emphasis on like, here are the worldviews, and here is how we can kind of almost put them in different typologies and have a competition, and the Bible is going to win, right? And for someone who, again, grew up in a kind of evangelical tradition, what attracted to me that is, like, I learned a lot more reading Reformed apologetics than I did in my public high school in suburban Maryland. Like, you learn a lot. But Augustine is not just a rationalist, right? He also famously, the emotional intensity of his writing. And some have even said what he was really trying to do was take the ancient philosophical elevation of reason down a notch or two and raise the affective. And his vision at Ostia with Monica is like a kind of choral audition to sing with the angels. And music was going to be the way we worship God, not a conversation at a first thing sermon. So now that can be, I'm not trying to, I'm not anti-rationalist, I'm not anti-intellectual. But there have been some who think the worldview approach, doesn't speak to the current generation, right? And I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I think some of the criticisms of Promethean autonomy when I talk to my undergrads, they don't seem to struggle with that. Like, Sisyphus is who they kind of feel is their story. And I was thinking about this during Carl Trueman's Erasmus lecture. Like, they don't think the arc of the universe bends towards justice. They think structural injustice is so great that it bears down upon them that they have no autonomy. Now, they're deeply moralized, they're technocratic, they're desecrated. I agree with a lot of the analysis. But I'm wondering, like, you know, a good old, it used to be evangelicals and early Christian historians. They didn't write political histories, they wrote lives of the saints. And they lifted up exemplars of lives that would be practical examples of Christian discipleship tied to the sacramental life of the church. Now, you have an incarnational spirit of your book, and you want it to be practical. There's study questions at the end of each chapter that shows you it's not a university press, graduate seminar book. It's meant to actually help people study. But just can you reflect a little bit about that kind of, is there a dangerous intellectualism that may be at odds, or how do you combine that with your kind of desire that Augustine has to shape people's loves and their hearts, not just their minds? Because some people, you do have some really, I found moving, also discussions of Augustine as dispossessive and kenotic, and that Augustine had a lot of intellectual conversions. I mean, what I find interesting, he's like probably the only church father who really knew what it meant to be a pagan, because he was a pagan, right? And he had multiple conversions, but he had affective ones, intellectual ones. Your book leans on the intellectual, right? Which again, in the grand scheme of evangelical world, I cheer. But I'm wondering about kind of where that world is. That world we grew up in, I feel like, has faded of apologetics. But how do you think about, like, not you should have written a different book, but like what really will change our culture? Is it a book like this, or is it a great novel, an artist, or all those things, because God's diversity is, exemplified in the kind of many gifts of the body of Christ?
I thought I'd be able to answer that until the last sentence.
Okay.
what will change our culture? Look, let me answer the bit about what I'm trying to do with writing it this way. This is very much the book that I wrote, sort of with the unleashed, if you like. So as an academic, you've got to pump out the monographs, and there's a certain rigor to that, and there's a certain propriety to that, and I don't complain. But, as I was saying earlier to Eric over dinner, both people who read my PhD thought it was quite nice. It's like there is a very restricted readership, and so my university doesn't really recognise this as proper work. So I've had to sort of do it in the cracks, because it isn't 10 footnotes a page, and it isn't some top university press, and that that's what they look at. But it's the book that I wanted to read when I was an undergraduate. In a big secular university, you've got Marx one week, you've got Foucault the next week, and you're going along to church on Sunday, and nobody has read these people, and it's like, oh, two different worlds. But they're actually talking about the same things. Like the sermon on Sunday is dealing with issues of identity and justice and hope, and you come and read these people, and they're doing the same thing. Like, why are they not talking to each other? And if I tried to, put my hand up in the seminars and say, Foucault saying, well, there's this verse in that would not have gone well. There was no common discourse, which was a shame. I think it's a shame for both.
The irony being, Foucault was deeply shaped and initiated into the Christian tradition, right?
But you've got to frame it in a very particular way to be allowed to talk about it in those circles. That's the irony. And often it's like the magisterial reformers can be free to sort of make moves that the next generation feels unable to, because they're sort of, there's nothing constraining them. It's the same. Foucault can talk about religion to his heart's content, properly, seeking properly to engage with it. Although he's on his own account, he doesn't do theology; he just does religious practice in a way that Foucault scholars perhaps don't feel able to do. But look, it's the book that I looked for as an undergrad, couldn't find, and then eventually over the years just sort of put the pieces together and decided that if no one else was going to write it, then I was going to have a go.
And like I mean, there's a lot of Alistair MacIntyre, a lot of Charles Taylor, and I can see particularly for church groups and lay readers kind of being initiated into those very influential Catholic thinkers. There's an ecumenical bent that you have too. I think it sort of has a winsome collection of people. But you're an expert in French thought, which I would say is not the wheelhouse of the average American evangelical reader. If anything, American evangelicalism, because of its strengths in apologetics of a certain kind, has a kind of connection more to Anglo-American analytic philosophy. So when Mark Knoll called for evangelicals to get over their anti-intellectualism, we had streams of evangelicals doing PhDs in analytic philosophy. And we have now many top-ranked analytic philosophers of religion are evangelicals. You know, how much theology they know is another question. But that said, and there is reference in your book to Derrida, to Ricoeur, to Lyotard, Tor, but they're not quite baked into the warp and woof of the book. I wonder if you could kind of just put your French studies scholar hat on and tell us what they might be able to offer contemporary Christian intellectual life. I mean, as I hinted, many of them themselves have complicated relationships to the Christian tradition, but certainly know it, right, in ways that, or they may know distortions of it, they may distort it themselves. But they're not, I mean, I sometimes when I encounter some of my colleagues, very, very educated, very, very bright, their knowledge of the Christian tradition is sort of like a third grade Baptist Sunday school, right? They just haven't had that encounter. Whereas so many of the kind of great French intellectuals have, again, complicated relationships, but, to take Derrida, playful with the category of the messianic, playful with the idea that Christianity has not fully become itself yet. His favorite verse is, "Come, Lord Jesus, come," right? Because we're still waiting. So kind of...
And his book, Sir Confessions, is a riff on Augustine's Confessions.
So they're religiously musical.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to answer the question. What is the French intellectual tradition that you obviously were attracted to at some point as an undergrad and a Christian? Just because it's kind of not, American theology is a little bit more German and British,
sure,
if you want to say it that way.
Sure, yeah. So, big picture then, specific answer to the question. So the big picture is the image that I have in my mind, the prayer that I pray, really, for this most often, is the idea that this book is a brick in a much bigger wall of Christian cultural and social theory, and it's my brick. It's the brick that I can lay, but I can't, obviously, as none of us can, build the wall. And my brick is necessarily sort of shaped around my expertise. It's going to have a lot of French thought in it because that's what I do. But there's going to be other bricks that are, analytic, that sit in the same wall. And there's going to be, the Gambian theologian who leans heavily on, sort of Gambian or Sub-Saharan African ideas, and that's going to look different. There's going to be the person with a nursing background who thinks these things through the lens of nursing. And so this book does a thing, but it's a brick, and it's not a wall. And it needs, and it beckons, and it longs for, and it prays for the wall to be built. So that's the big picture thing. The little things like, so what are one of my French thinkers doing in the book? A number of different things. I think, like, Charles Spurgeon used to give his trainees books to read that he knew were heretical, because he wanted to sharpen them up and to get them to, like, what is wrong with this? Like, what is going on here, and how would you critique it? So there's part of it is that the more one reads of people who one doesn't agree with, the more sharply one comes to understand one's own position. There's also the idea, I think, that and this is something that Merrill Westphal, as sort of Christian Kierkegaard specialist, says. And I don't think I go quite as far as him, but I know what he's talking about. He says that these masters of suspicion, as Ricoeur calls them, Marx, Freud and Nietzsche, he calls them prophets. Not in the sense that they're speaking the words of God, but in the sense that they're pointing to things that may otherwise have remained in our blind spots, that we may not necessarily have been sensitive to. On the principle that we all have our cultural blind spots. There's no sort of position that has a 20/20 vision of everything. And so, although, Derrida and so forth have massive blind spots as well, and although one wouldn't want to remake the faith in the image of someone like Derrida, although people have tried, that his blind spots will be different to mine. And therefore, there's something to be gained. Not that I take what he says at face value and sort of appropriate it, but that something that he says about justice or whatever. I think, well, that's really interesting. Let me take that then back to the Bible, look at it in the light of the Scriptures, and see what the Bible has to say about that particular way of looking at things, and one can sort of broaden one's sensitivities in that way. And so there's that sense, and that's not just true of these French thinkers, of course. It's true of anyone that one reads. And so I think part of what I'm saying is I don't think there's anything qualitatively unique about the French thinkers. I'm not saying to everybody, go out and read Derrida and Foucault and then the church will be much better for it. I think but there is something precious about reading any thoughtful position that is different to ours. There's something to be gained from that. And my particular neck of the woods is the French philosophers, so they're the people that I've read, and that's what I bring to bear in my particular brick in the wall.
Augustine. And then we're going to open things up. So Augustine writes at a time when all sorts of cultural ideals are in flux. There's been a lot of articles in Augustine studies analogizing his time to our time, trying to help Christians think about the fall of Rome, which shattered many of their ideals as well. And the pagans were blaming the Christians because their meek religion of the Sermon on the Mount had kind of corrupted the empire, and that's why it fell. And Augustine says, no, look at your violence, look at your corruption, look at your sins. And you pick up on, a kind of the first half of the City of God is the kind of critical analysis, and then the second half is as a kind of constructive vision. So, one of the things I've always liked about Augustine is that he doesn't just give you something to stand against.
Yes.
He tries to give you something to live for. And you end your book in a similar fashion to the City of God by reflections on eschatology, the kind of fancy word for the last things. And Augustine is often read as a profoundly eschatological thinker. I just was reading this with some undergrads, and it's amazing to read theology with smart, illiterate, secular people. And Augustine's weird. He has these weird, what's the body going to be like in heaven? What was sex like before the fall? He has this imagination that kind of liberates the mind, I think, and the spirit. But he's often seen as eschatological, but not apocalyptic. Okay, which is also a big term in contemporary intellectual circles. By which I mean, he tends to defer the meaning of history to after history. And you pick up on some of this, which relates to humility. The inbreaking of the kingdom of God has come in the Christ event. But after the close of prophecy, we can't discern the signs of the kingdom. Right? I'm giving a somewhat contested reading, but I just want to kind of draw you out. What Augustine gives you is a kind of spirituality for the long haul. Right? He tells the people who are predicting the end times to rest their fingers, right? Because they used to count the biblical prophecies kind of like many evangelicals do today. And it's meant to supply not a pessimism that it's going to be one damn thing after another, nor an optimism that we can recreate the world, but a kind of maybe diagonalized piety that works for justice but doesn't expect the eradication of all injustices. And a familiar charge of Augustine is that he never quite abandoned his Platonism, that he kind of puts all the real action in a separate realm. You know, kind of like sometimes people say about von Balthasar, a Catholic theologian, that all the theodrama is in the Christ event, or what is to come. And for Augustine, all the action is in the biblical story. But what's the relationship between the biblical story of salvation and our cultural and even, I'll say, political history? Right? I mean, one advantage of a kind of mid-20th century Augustinianism in someone like Reinhold Niebuhr was divine providence is inscrutable. Don't think you have God on your side, but try to work for things which come out of biblical anthropology, right? Work for justice, right? At the same time, though, Augustine is weird because he also seems to think that Christian public officials can use their offices to refer temporal virtues to their eternal destiny, that they should adopt Christian morality, that they should enforce the judgments of the church, even against schismatic Donatists. Right? So Christian politics and politicians should put their office in the imperial service of a divine economy, it seems. He kind of wants his apocalyptic cake and eat it too. He kind of puts everything else there, but he's writing, he says we live in Christian times, after Christ. And the witness of the gospel is not just to the individual heart of the evangelical believer in their piety, but it should be revealed publicly in the ministry of the church and the ministry of the political community. He believed in Christian emperors. So there's this kind of almost schizophrenia sometimes, like Augustine has been used to, become the charter of liberal democracy because he separates the two cities. And because he kind of, he's not a Democrat, even though Joe Biden invokes Augustine in his first inaugural. We could talk about common objects of love. I think it was actually a really good initiation. When he did that, the world of Augustine scholarly Twitter went crazy. I got into a thing with a conservative Catholic about how you interpret Augustine. It was American civil religion. It was not Augustine, right? But it was common objects of love. I think that's a good question. What do we as Americans love? Yeah. But maybe that's one way to... Is America theologically interesting to you as an Augustinian? Or the civil rights movement? Or Israel and Gaza? Or Russia and Ukraine? Like, are those legible to divine action? Or is it all the story of Israel, biblical Israel, and Jesus? Because that's what the hunger I think a lot of my young Christians have is to relate the biblical story to the world they're living in. And sometimes the Augustinian just says, well, Augustine says early in his life, all I care about is God and the soul. Right? Don't sweat the small stuff, the fall of Rome, right? The election of Donald Trump, the election of Joe Biden. I'm not trying to be, maybe with Rusty here, he and I can become a little political and polemical with each other. But there is this schizophrenia. So kind of, A, how do you read Augustine on this? And B, like, what does that mean a modern-day Augustinian might think about, like, how do you really bring theology to bear? I mean, evangelicals, there's a lot of homiletical reflections on contemporary affairs. But I wouldn't say they're deeply theological in the sense that you have outlined in terms of putting it in the redemptive historical story. And if anything, there's something called the spirituality of the church in Reformed circles. It was very popular among the Confederate South. Like, the church is this colony of heaven. Don't bother us with slavery. Right? That might be unjust. But it has nothing to do with Christian discipleship. Right? Now, I'm being a little crude here, but and actually it's a very interesting, one of the movements in contemporary Augustinian studies I find very interesting is recognizing the fact that Augustine lived in a slave society. And slaves were everywhere in his house. And literal slavery, but also metaphorical slavery. Augustine says we are slaves to sin, but we are also called to be slaves to God. The new translation of Augustine's Confessions controversially translate God not as Lord, but as Master. It's a master who is unaccountable to us. Raises very interesting theological questions about divine accountability. I'm going on a tangent here. I'll get back to Chris.
Which bit am I going to?
Yeah. I want you to respond to, your vision. I mean, one of the things I think your book does at the end is revive the philosophy of history, which used to be a big thing also in mid-20th century. People who would have been, I don't know when first things started, but Marathon et al. Wrote books on the philosophy of history. That's kind of a historical topic now in philosophy departments. No one writes the philosophy of history anymore. But Augustine, and in part, a biblical critical theory, I think, is a big enough story that one question is what does history mean? And is it just this salvation story, and everything that happens along the way is... I mean, you do have some nice lines in there about how Exodus is particular, but also universalizable. So maybe that's one way your book writes about this. So how do we do the particular and the universal, especially in light of this question of eschatology? And Augustine, there's a benefit to postponing, I think especially, in our era of everybody going, making everything theologically significant. Whether you believe in a 0.3% increase in the tax rate or 0.5%. Right?
Yes.
But maybe there are some things where even an Augustinian can say, the kingdom of God is among us here.
Yeah. Just half a sentence on Master and Lord, because I can't resist, and then then the other stuff. Well, our Master did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And in Philippians 2, our Master did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. And so I think our appeal to the world is, show me another Master who has served in that way. Mm-hmm. Your corporation doesn't love you like that. Your bank account doesn't love you like that. Even your family can't love you like that. You don't love yourself like that. Everyone has a Master. The question is, have you chosen your Master wisely? You will serve something in the Bob Dylan lyrics, even if it is your own will. But only we have a Master who has served us and died for us. So I think that's...
We have a benevolent Master.
Yes, to the point of death and beyond. Not just sort of reasonably benevolent, but extravagantly, superabundantly benevolent.
But then Jesus calls us his friend.
There you go. And we're also slaves.
So how can a slave be a friend?
So my Augustine, by which I mean sort of what I've taken from the City of God, not being an Augustine scholar and not having read all this literature, is really sort of quote unquote relevant, to use the word that my students always use to me, in a in your face sort of way, and in a very cheeky sort of way as well. So, City of God, book 1, paragraph 1, word 1, gloriosissimam, civitatem Dei. The most glorious City of God is my theme. And so what I take him to be doing, and I got this from Charles Matthews, is he's taking Rome's prime value. Rome is the glorious city. We pride ourselves and identify as the glorious ones, and using that as the very first word of his. He hasn't had a chance to set any context. He hasn't said, "Now I'm going to use the word glory. I don't mean what Rome means by it. Don't get your knickers in a twist about this." He slams it in their face and provokes them. This is your prime political value. Yeah. I'm saying the City of God is this, and then as you read on in the text, you see that. But he does define glory, and glory is Lazarus sitting at the rich man's gate, flea-ridden, sort of overlooked by those who pass by. That is glory, says Augustine. Again, extremely provocatively to Rome, who says, we're the glorious ones. And, the Roman at that point says, you've absolutely lost the plot. What on earth could you possibly mean? There is nothing less glorious than Lazarus. And then, of course, he goes on to say that the welcome that Lazarus gets in Abraham's bosom puts any Roman retinue to shame. No Caesar parading in triumphal procession through the streets of Rome can hold a candle to what Lazarus is going to experience in Abraham's bosom. It makes it look like some sort of poor, shredded photocopy of glory. And what he's done brilliantly at that point is, I think, what Paul does with Greek wisdom and the Jewish demand for signs in 1 Corinthians 1, which is if you like, a two-punch combination, to use a slightly more bellicose metaphor than perhaps I would if I'd had long to think about it. But so he's put an absolute antithesis between Roman glory and God's glory. Like, this is not your glory, Rome. This is Lazarus, that you think is maximally inglorious. And in the same way that Paul says, God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. This is not your wisdom. I come with the logos of the cross. You do not think this wise. You think this the epitome of foolishness. So there's that moment of antithesis, which already is a very provocative cultural critique. But he follows that up by saying, if you are really serious about glory and want to find the fullness of this thing that you keep bragging about, then where you will find it is the place that you would least think ever of looking for it. It is in Lazarus, because he's the one who's going to be welcomed into Abraham's bosom, and that is a glory that you've never dreamed of. In the same way that Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 1 to the Greeks, if you're really serious about this thing you call wisdom, which, by the way, you have been looking for in all the wrong places, and you haven't found, have you, because you keep bouncing from one philosophical school to the other, hoping that round the corner you're going to find it. If you're willing to look for it, at the point of maximal foolishness for you, which is the cross, you think it's stupid, it's moronic. If you're willing to look for it there, you will find a wisdom, the depth, and the riches of which you've never even imagined, the fullness of the thing you're looking for. And so there's this double movement of antithesis and fulfillment. Like, this is not your glory, this is real glory. And I think that as a move of cultural engagement is incredibly powerful and incredibly relevant. So Paul is doing it with wisdom and power. Augustine is doing it with glory. In our society, probably freedom is the one of the great values. You could do it with equality. There's a subtlety to it that I think combines the best of that sort of Christianity, which is always wanting to denounce the culture and put clear blue water between the gospel and the culture, come out from among them, there's a difference here, let's not get the things mixed up. Takes what's best in there, and the best of the sort of Christianity that, wears the ripped jeans and the t-shirt and wants to be relevant to the culture, and, what you're searching for, find it in Christ, but reduces to neither of those. And so the way that I've read Augustine is in that really provocative mode, where there is this immediate relevance, like whatever it is that you most treasure, late Roman world, late modern world, the gospel speaks directly to that thing, both to subvert and to fulfill it, but does so in the context of the big story. So there isn't a trade-off between that big picture. It's the biblical story that makes sense of the immediate political stakes.
And I love that you started with the opening line of the City of God. If you haven't read the preface, it's like one page. You don't have to read the rest of the 1,000 pages.
It's all there.
It's all in that one paragraph where he quotes the Aeneid, right? And like that they claim to be merciful and just, right?
And that is it that same page where he says Rome has been mastered by its own lust for mastery. Yeah. Just so incisive.
The libido dominandi is the lust that comes to dominate you.
Yeah.
Now, and so I'll end with this, and then we can open up. I hinted, you have that's the Augustinian dispossession, that we are tempted to be dominated by our lust. Look at the hissing cauldron of lust in your society. Look at the spectacles that you cut enjoyment out of. And you, again, that antithesis and fulfillment and subversion, you do a lot with being under the logic of the cross. Maybe even I once asked a prominent Augustine historian, like, how does a historian write history after the close of prophecy for an Augustinian? And she said, very carefully, and I probably shouldn't do it, but if I do it, I'll do history from below. Mm-hmm. Right, which is a term you use.
Yeah, it's Richard Bauckham.
Richard Bauckham's right, history from below, and again the kind of Christian sensitivity to the stranger, and to the big story that's going on. Sometimes a certain Augustinian stream is not the big story we're reading about in the New York Times. Right, it's the hidden history of love in individuals and in society. And that can, again, lead towards a kind of, not indifference, sometimes charged with quietism. But at the end of the book, I also sensed you embrace liberal democracy. You endorse a history from below. And sometimes I wonder if the Augustinian soil upon which democracy grew, and tolerance, makes it impossible now to have a comprehensive Christian society. Because democracy, tolerance, and pluralism are ingredients that make which is why, for a long period of time in evangelical circles, at least intellectuals, have been attracted to Stanley Hauerwas. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And I just did a thing with a very prominent evangelical who said evangelicals need to withdraw from culture for a while because we've done too much damage. Right? But, so how do you... this combination of your support of democracy, your support of tolerance, your winsomeness, but also, do you desire to live in a Christian political society? I read Josh Hawley on the way up, his essay, and actually found it very attractive. Which would horrify, I'm the former chair of the Humanities Council at Princeton University, and now I'm a Christian nationalist. But
how you have fallen.
Yeah. I'm just not sure how to put all those pieces together. Yeah. So the kind of democracy, the tolerance, the from below.
Yeah.
But you don't talk about abortion in your book.
Sure.
You don't talk about the sexual revolution that much.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you give resources for all these. This is not so much a criticism. But yeah. Maybe also because you're British who lives in Australia. I don't want to draw you into the American. You can't imagine a Christian political society in Australia. But we're kind of living in the breakup of one in America.
Sure. Which I guess is what the UK and Australia went through, but a generation before, and slower. I think it's happening more quickly here than it happened in Hungary. Anyway. With certain reservations that we can go into when we have it back and forth, if you like, I think the paradigm of exile is helpful for understanding where Christians are situated. So, beginning of 1 Peter, I think, lends itself to that reading. And so you ask Daniel in exile, do you want to live in a theocratic society? He would say, yes, with all my heart, I yearn for that. I long for that. I pray for that. That doesn't stop me seeking the peace and prosperity of the city, seeking the shalom of the city where God has called me, in conformity with Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, in the present. And I think so my reading of that letter to the exiles, which I think is an Augustinian reading, but you may not like this might not work, basically, what I'm about to say, is how can Jeremiah write that? Because this is Babylon. This is not your friendly neighborhood country. This is not your teddy bear country. Like, Babylon is nasty. So how can he say, with God's authority, work for the shalom of Babylon? Because he's clearly not saying to the exiles, whatever Babylon tells you to do, just do it. Because that would, break fundamental commandments of God. So how does that work? And I think the brilliance of it, I would be really interested to hear what you think, Eric, is that it avoids two errors that Christians are being invited to occupy today, and it allows us a way through them. And the first error is that the only way that you can live in society is by sharing its greatest good. You have to have the ultimate good in common in order to be a member of society. And that works itself out slightly differently in different political sort of contexts. So that greatest good, often from a more conservative position, will be a patriotic good. You must be a patriot, a good patriot. And then, you can sort of add the details afterwards. And from a more progressive position, it's often couched in terms of certain values, diversity, equality, and so forth. You have to sign up to these values, which are in fact our greatest good. Otherwise, you can't really be a proper member of society. So you've got to share the greatest good in common, which of course, for Daniel in Babylon, I would suggest for Christians in contemporary society, is impossible. We cannot share. Our greatest good is to glorify God and to honour Him, and we're never going to share that with secular society. That's never going to work. But the only other option then, if you cannot share the greatest good, is, well, that there's no common good then. There's nothing common that can hold society together. And this is your sort of critical race theory position. This is Derek Bell's position. There can be no common cause between black people and white people in America. White people are constitutively unable to work for the benefit of other communities. He has this idea called convergence theory, which is all the moves in society that looked as though they were making life better for black people were in fact serving the interests of white people. So there's no common good. Let's not fool ourselves. But what I think Jeremiah is enjoining on the exiles is to seek what we might call a proximate common good. So, if Babylon prospers, you will prosper. In the sense that if the society sort of works, it's good for Babylon, and it's good for you. Now, it's not your greatest good. That's not what you're ultimately there for. But it's and my reading of this, and this is where I'd be really interested in what you think, Eric, is that's what Augustine is doing with splendid vices. So that there are these things that Rome does that make society work better. So courage, for example, or patriotism in Rome. They're vicious in the sense that they're not Godward, they are a disordered love, but a society where people are appropriately courageous and appropriately patriotic sort of works better than a society where it's anarchy and everyone's just doing what they want. And so there's a good, there's a certain peace, there's a certain prosperity that comes from that. And so at this level of proximate goods, peace is by and large better than war in most cases, that sort of thing, that there can be a common good across a genuinely pluralist society where different communities have different ultimate goods, and where therefore Christians are allowed to have a distinctive ultimate good that's not subsumed under some sort of quasi-universal values. Mm-hmm. And that's how to build a pluralist society. Not by forcing everyone to have the same ultimate good, or saying that there's no possibility of a common good at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm very much in sympathy with that. I mean, I like the exilic wisdom. I like the distinction between the ultimate and the penultimate. And I do think Augustine loved mosaics, and that there's he also was a pastor, and he writes about some people need the gospel, some people need the law. It just depends. Some people need hope, some people need to be made aware of their sin. And there's a kind of rhetorical, prudential wisdom as to where you are in any given cultural contingent moment, I guess. There is a sense in which, though, at times he does think that Rome's origins in a fratricidal murder is its destiny, which kind of reminds you of America's origins in white supremacy and slavery is its destiny, of the Derek Bell kind. Now, I think, so if there's a limit to Augustine, famously, it doesn't mean, I think original sin is actually a category coming back. It's kind of a secular version of structural injustice, or the kind of weight of history type thing.
But can I put a footnote on it? But the difference is that the Christian original sin is democratizing. It's not divisive. It's what Chesterton says, there's a fellowship of original sin between the king and the beggar, but you don't get that with structural injustice.
Yeah, that's another good example of the sorts of things he does throughout his book, right? So, I do think, I sometimes worry about the Roman Catholic language of a common good. I wonder if we could talk about shared goods. The common good has a bit too much of a presupposition And I understand that this would get us into things, but yes, I think there is a kind of Augustinian sense of shared goods
within things.
Yes, I think Augustine gets into subsidiarity. I think there's reasons. It's always interesting to me why modern Catholic social teaching has been more Thomistic, right? And there hasn't been. We've had Augustinian popes, but if you look at who the leading Catholic intellectuals are on ethics, law, and politics, they aren't deeply rooted so much in Augustine. It's been a kind of Thomistic, maybe because Augustine is also not a systematic thinker. He's a jazz musician. He's always playing with things. But I do think the spirit of the concern for Babylon and for his city, but always with this exilic pilgrimage motif. I think that maybe is what the Christian tradition is trying to sort out, responding to this question of, do you want a theocratic society? Augustine hungers for one, right? But he knows because of sin, because of finitude, and because ultimately it will be an action of God's grace.
Yeah, exactly. So the next question is, how will that come about? How can we seek to bring that about?
Right.
That's often where the rubber hits.
Right. And Augustine is usually not seen as a revolutionary in that respect. Open it up to questions.
Just one question. We gotta end. We have to end soon, but
Yeah.
we can certainly do one.
I
Maybe
hope
two.
that I can bring this together. Your reverence at the end of Catholics is, when I first heard this talk, I wanted to I thought, the church, what can the church do about this critical theory? I thought, I've been in academia, so I wondered, why hasn't this happened before? Why are we just now talking about it? By the way, I have taught Augustine. Confessions, great books classes. But I was raised Roman Catholic, pre-Vatican II, and there's something about the way you're talking that kind of jams my head, because I don't know the Protestants very well. So can you give me some idea of why this is coming out of, you alluded to it just now, but why is this coming out of it? Evangelicals, I never knew a Baptist when I was growing up. I never knew a Jew. So why is this coming all of a sudden out of the Reformed evangelical tradition and not the Catholic Church?
This is a really helpful question. So what was your name?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Look, I think part of the answer is perhaps the difference between British evangelicalism and US evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of brought up in a church community that read, a lot of John Stott, who was very socially engaged and writing on social issues. And so that's always sort of been the air that I've breathed. And so writing this book was sort of continuing on in a tradition of thought that I'd already been brought up in. But perhaps there's a difference.
I think there is a big difference between British evangelicalism and US evangelicalism on this front, and also just the politics don't map on, because British evangelicalism tends to be far to the left on economics, and just much more less aligned to a particular party. I think Augustine among evangelicals, he kind of is sometimes read as an evangelical. Look, he has a conversion. He loves the Bible. He loves Jesus, and so they read him as like he must have gone to a Billy Graham crusade, right? And there has been a deep hunger among evangelicals. I wouldn't, uncharitably, it would be for intellectual authority. Charitably, it'd be for reconnecting with the great tradition of the church. And Augustine is just the obvious person to go to, because he gives the church its voice, its vocabulary. We're kind of hinting at different Augustinianisms, but that's because Augustine is so massively influential. There's a famous definition that Protestantism is the triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over his doctrine of the church.
Yes.
We haven't talked much about the church. There's not a lot of church in your book.
We could come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so I think, and one of the leading popular Augustine writers right now, James K.A. Smith, is a kind of very popular evangelical writer. He wrote an interesting piece on thinking with Augustine while watching the new Robert Scorsese Killers movie. So yeah, there is a kind of Augustinian moment among evangelicals who kind of like his spirituality. They like maybe the cultural criticism. And he kind of sounds so contemporary.
Oops.
Maybe one more question?
So just one he's a gateway drug, isn't he, into church history?
Yeah.
And also because the Confessions is so helpful for identity, and identity is the big issue. He's touching on a lot of things that are really of cultural moment.
Yeah.
As well.
Although my undergrads are often disappointed by what was promised to them in the Confessions. It's a little less crazy than their average Thursday night. Yeah, maybe there's one in the back, yeah.
Thank you all. The beginning of the discussion talked about two streams, critical theory, Marx and Nietzsche, and it seems for the past 4 years, and the continuing trend is that Nietzschean politics is going to become sort of the major force, at least here in America. I feel like the era of caring about justice is sort of the blip, and the real trend is going to be people who, I think both from the left and the right, who sort of say, caring about justice, these values, that's whack. We just want power. We saw that in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks with academics, cheering on terrorists, and then you see people on the right sort of saying, Christianity, that's just a slave religion born out of resentment. And given that, how do you guys sort of respond to that critique against someone who, I feel like in most instances of the narration maneuver, it's sort of assuming that the person is misguided, wants to be told a better story. But what do you do with someone who, at one point, just sort of rejects, just wants power, and sees Christians as weak?
Do you want to go first on this?
I think that's for you first, Chris.
Okay, I'll go first. It's often the observation is often made, isn't it, that democracy works well in the West because of it is a flower that blooms in biblical soil, and when Western sort of concepts of democracy have been transplanted into other parts of the world, it hasn't gone so well, because there aren't the same intuitions and predispositions that make sense of that allow democracy to work. So what would you then expect as the West sort of disentangles itself more and more from its Christian heritage? Would you expect democracy to be strengthened by that move or to be weakened? I think it would be reasonable, given the sort of data set of how democracy has gone in different parts of the world, to start with an assumption that would weaken democratic institutions and that would destabilise democracy, which needs these sort of self-policing buffers of civility and so forth to work. And I'm no political scientist, so this is just sort of a lay person's view, but it seems to me not a million miles away from what we're seeing, and sort of the Nietzscheanism of modern political life that you're alluding to. That there aren't the common assumptions about the way the world works anymore, and what is coming in to fill that vacuum is a sort of possibly, and again, Eric, you will know much more about this than I do, sort of going back to a more muscular Roman way of thinking about power. And that's not massively compatible with the sort of democracy that we've got. So I think the eruptions, one way of reading the eruptions that we're seeing at the moment is what happens when you take away the soil in which the flower of democracy is blooming, which is a fundamentally biblical sort of infused soil.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm sympathetic to that concern. In fact, when my colleagues question me flirting with the religious right too much, I say, wait till you see the post-religious right. Which I think is on the horizon. We were talking at dinner about, people who call themselves evangelical, who, because they align with a certain political vision, who don't go to church, who don't read the Bible, who don't, didn't have a conversion experience, didn't read the 4 spiritual laws. So and I do see almost like sometimes on university campuses a kind of Maoist Nietzschean effort. I wouldn't overplay that though. I think there's a few faculty. Maybe I'm too hopeful, but I think there's a correction going on many campuses, and there's a kind of new alliance among conservatives and classic liberals that might challenge the kind of cultural Marxist new left. And I think the student body certainly is not represented by that. If anything, I don't think it's Nietzsche, I think it's McKinsey that's the threat to the university. I mean, it's a kind of neoliberal managerial ethos. It's Weber, right? So there are challenges, but I guess, like as a good evangelical, I think we are called to love justice and, mercifully walk humbly with God. So in response to the power and the domination, I think maybe King was America's great Augustinian. Augustine was no pacifist, but he did think that the kind of reduction of everything to power and domination is against the grain of the universe and against the God of Israel. So I think it is a dangerous moment, and I do think there's something whispering in the humanities, although it's happened for a long time, that we're sort of even now past the legacy of Kant and Hegel that still had the scent of Christianity to them. Yeah. They still had the hope of redemption. They still had the hope of justice, albeit in heretical ways. But once that legacy and hope is gone, that's why we have to either create small communities and go back to Benedict or retrieve Aristotle.
Join me in thanking our